Welcome back to Young Heretics Conversations. This is our occasional interview series where I get to chat with people who are doing interesting work about interesting things in contemporary life, bringing ancient principles and values to bear on our modern situation. I mentioned that I've been doing a little traveling, so it's a good opportunity to drop some of these interviews. I'm actually back now. I've just gotten back from Hungary, from Budapest. If you can see and you're watching on YouTube, you will note I've come back with a mustache. I went overseas to acquire one. They're very difficult to obtain on the black market, but I managed to shave my beard into one of these cool mustaches all the kids are doing these days. Not sure how long it's going to last. Maybe you can drop a note in the comments about whether you think it's a good look or not. But that's actually not the most important thing about my trip. The most important thing about the travel I've just been doing is that I was in Hungary for a conference at the Danube Institute, which is a think tank, and they had gathered together some American scholars, some Hungarian scholars, and some European scholars to discuss the birth rate crisis. This is something that Hungary is very much involved in, invested in, but it's not just a Hungarian issue, it's a worldwide issue. There is this crazy birth dearth going on. Birth rates are plummeting in the East and in the West, in highly developed nations and in less developed nations, with very few exceptions. People are having fewer kids, and this seems to represent, well, what does it represent? I think it represents at least a kind of uncertainty about the future and about the human race itself. We've talked a lot about various aspects of this, and I want to get back to debriefing some of it next week with you guys, what was discussed. Really interesting set of talks and panels about just how we can restore the kind of hopefulness and optimism that is required to have babies and perpetuate the species and go on advancing our civilization. So this is not just something that Hungary is concerned with, although it was interesting to hear about some of the stuff they've been doing over there, what's worked, what hasn't, think about what we can do in the US and in other Western nations. I'm going to debrief you on all of that, but interestingly, right before I left to do this conference, I actually had a conversation that dovetails perfectly with what I was discussing in Hungary. So I was there to speak on the political reality of the spiritual dimension. And the talk that I gave is online. I'll link to it on YouTube. You can watch what I said and what the other panelists said. But basically, the point of it was you can make whatever laws you want. You can incentivize having kids this, that, and the other way. You can give tax breaks. You can do all sorts of legal things to try to get people to have kids. But if their heart's not in it, ultimately no policy is going to make this happen. You can't just force it. This is actually a spiritual issue. This is one of the most concrete ways in which the attitude that you have about life and the future and eternity and metaphysics comes right down to earth in the attitude that you have about humanity and politics and how we ought to operate together as a society. Politics in the deep classical sense of life lived together. Mankind is a social, a political animal, and there is a religious dimension to that, whether we like it or not, whether we want to talk about it or not. So that was what my speech was about. And I was basically saying, you can't actually legislate this into existence. You need a spiritual revival, and you need this thing that we have been talking about a lot on the show and hoping for. You need a return to faith. And there are some really hopeful signs in America right now. For the first time in my lifetime, there have been some fascinating results, for example, from the Pew Research Institute. They have this massive study called the Religious Landscape Study that's been going on for years. There are 35,000 people, participants in all 50 states, talking about what they believe. And for a long time, people have been declining in their religious observance. It's been going down. Fewer and fewer people going to church. This latest version that just came out, this latest result that just came out, indicates that maybe we've bottomed out, which would even suggest that we might be able to reverse that decline. Now, it's very early days, and there are still some parts of the study that are more worrying, but there is raw energy suddenly in the air, and there's this sense that there's new energy to harness going on, especially in America, but also across the West. And one of the most urgent political questions, philosophical questions right now is, how do you harness that energy? Where does it go? in how can it go in healthy directions rather than unhealthy directions? And like I said, that's what I was in Hungary to discuss. But right before I went to Hungary, I had this great conversation with none other than Justin Brierley, who is basically the perfect person to discuss these matters. He's been observing what he calls the surprising rebirth of Christianity and Christian faith, belief in God. More generally, he's been observing this in podcasts and books for years and years. And he and I have had an online correspondence, but this is our first time really having a face-to-face conversation. We got into all of these issues and more. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump into it and play you this fantastic conversation I had with my new friend, Justin Brierley. Well, I'm very much looking forward to this conversation with my new friend, Justin Brierley. He's a UK-based author, broadcaster, and speaker who has been hosting conversations between Christians and non-Christians for over 20 years. He's the author of the wonderful book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. And he's got a new book coming out called Why I'm Still a Christian, which I've had the pleasure of looking at in advance, and everybody who listens to this podcast is going to want to pre-order it. I doubt that I have a single listener that shouldn't be reading this book. Justin, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. I should employ you as my PR manager with that kind of an intro, Spencer. So
I take a very reasonable percentage off the top. Actually, I think you'll find I'm quite easy to work with. So we'll talk after.
Excellent.
But this is kind of, Justin. This is kind of your moment, I feel. Tell me if I'm wrong, but you've been on this beat, this rebirth of belief beat, for some time. I've been following you for several years, but as I just said, you've been podcasting about the return of faith for 20 years. And I'm curious, first of all, whether you also feel, as I do, that the last several months have brought really rapid development, sort of akin to the, how did you go bankrupt very slowly and then all at once? It's felt in the States, at least, as if many things that you and I both have been tracking for a while have suddenly come roaring into the public consciousness in a big way. Is that true also in the UK for you? And if so, to what would you attribute this moment?
I think that is common to both the UK and the USA. That there are some differences, and could go into those later, but yeah, I mean, you've sketched it out very well there, which is that I have been kind of involved in hosting faith debates for 20 years or so. And that started in the heyday of the New Atheism, and we did all those big classic debates between Christians and atheists. But then it was around 2018, I kind of noticed just a shift in the atmosphere of the conversations. I noticed a lot more of these secular intellectuals giving Christianity a second look. That the waning of the new atheist thing seemed to have really started by that point. And you were seeing these interesting people like Jordan Peterson and others coming on the scene and talking just very different ways about Christian faith and that sort of thing. So I kind of picked that up, started hosting some of those conversations, and decided, I guess somewhere around 2020, that there was enough going on by that point. And with the pandemic upon us, I thought that it feels like that someone needs to sort of talk about this change in the conversation. So I started thinking about the book, starting to write the book around then. It didn't then get published till 2023. So, and I remember when it was published, sort of, well, at the time I kind of submitted the manuscript. You know what it's like with these things. You kind of end up, you've written it about maybe even a year ahead of time, and then you go through all the editing process and so on, and finally gets published. And at the time that I wrote it, I thought, I wonder if anyone else will kind of take this seriously, or well, they'll just say, well, this is just interesting anecdotes, Justin, of a few eccentric intellectuals who are talking a bit differently about Christianity. But by the time it actually got published in summer of 2023, it felt like there'd been quite a sea change already by that point, just in the 1 year since I'd sort of essentially, brought the manuscript together. And because suddenly lots of influencers were talking about, for want of a better word, this surprising rebirth of belief in God, this sense that new atheism had overplayed its hand, that whole movement had sort of splintered and actually was arguably, to blame for the sort of ideological culture wars that were now rampant. I was bumping into more and more people who were describing themselves as lapsed atheists, saying, I've been let down. I'm not convinced anymore by the promises of secular culture. And then just literally a couple of months after the book was published, Ayaan Hirsi Ali publishes this extraordinary article called Why I'm Now a Christian, in which essentially the most famous female atheist in the world says, right, I've become a Christian for intellectual reasons and because of a personal meaning crisis. And this was basically an encapsulation of what I was sort of saying in the book was happening. So it did feel like suddenly it caught this wave just at the time it was published. And then since then, we're speaking now about a year and a half on from the publication of the book. I feel like it's only accelerated. There's just been story after story of more of these public intellectuals, either on a journey to faith or becoming Christians. And just the thing that I think I've been most surprised by, though, is that sort of what I was describing as a sort of secular intellectual elites talking differently about God has also been met by a kind of groundswell from beneath of just people who appear to be desperate for a better story. And you're now seeing all of these, at the time of recording, polls and stats about Gen Z being the most open generation, and the Bible sales rocketing, being driven by Gen Z of all things. And here in the UK, with there's some extraordinary statistics about to be published on both the rise generally in church attendance, but also a more than quadrupling of young men in church. No one expected that. That's almost feels like it's almost come out of nowhere. It is, as you said, very sudden. It feels like things are changing quite quickly. So it's exciting. And I don't claim to have any special powers of prediction or prophecy, but for whatever reason, the thing I'd kind of spied, 4 or 5 years ago when I started the process of writing this book seems to have suddenly caught fire. And it's exciting to be in the middle of that.
I listened to your podcast about the Asbury revival, which was this, you can probably explain it better than I can, but it was sort of a remarkable moment in this very, very small college town at a chapel. And one of the themes you really interrogated in that was just what is a revival? What counts as a revival? How do you know when you're in one? And so my next question for you is sort of, how soon can we pop the champagne? I feel like the current situation, I've now gotten used to saying it's very early and we don't totally know where these trends are going. And I make all these disclaimers, that there's a way in which you don't want to get burned by what will, in retrospect, perhaps look like naive optimism, declaring victory, faith is back, And because it's been so bleak for so long, the numbers have only been trending downward. You see even a glimmer of an inflection point, to mix metaphors, and you start to think, you really want, I guess, to say, well, the pendulum is swinging. And it does seem significant, what we're living through, as you've just articulated. But I'm curious, do you have sort of markers that you are watching, or is there a point at which you'll feel as if this is something more lasting and significant?
Yeah, it's really difficult because I have stood back from using the R word, revival, even though when I sort of wrote an article a year or so ago for The Spectator, they actually put the word revival in the title. A Christian revival is underway in the UK. That wasn't the title I chose for it, and I kind of was actually at pains to say, look, this is just the beginnings of something, if it's anything. I suppose I'm more confident now than I was a year ago to say, no, it does really feel like something's happening, but I'm still reticent to call it revival. I think, if you go to the the history books of revival, they do have a certain type of character, and they are these very specific movements that are essentially judged on the fruit, not necessarily the emotion or the things that were happening at the time, but what did that produce in terms of converts, churches that were planted, the differences they made in the cultures that they happened in. So I think you can only really ever use the word at a bit of distance from them. You never really know exactly what you're in the middle of when it's happening. I think, I mean, it's interesting because you mentioned the Asbury revival. Well, they again chose not to use the R word for that. They prefer to call it an awakening, and I think that might be more what I'm willing to talk about at this point. There's a kind of a new awareness, a new openness to faith, to God, but as with all things, humans have an incredible capacity to mess things up, and it could go off in all kinds of different directions.
Never bet against us in that respect.
Yeah, exactly. So I've often, thought actually, because I grew up in a church that often talked about revival and prayed for revival. That was something in the kind of charismatic evangelical background I grew up in was a thing. And I often wondered in retrospect if the reason we never saw the revival we were hoping for was because we just wouldn't have been able to handle it if it had happened. We would have kind of messed it up so badly, because it's frequently the case that when the church does get a little bit of a taste of influence and power, it quickly, goes to its head and all sorts of things go wrong. So there's almost a sense in which I feel what we would rather have, what would be better for us in a sense, is a sort of quiet revival, a sort of something that doesn't make us get too big for our boots, that where hopefully we can hold on to a sense of humility. But that, I do want to sort of also not negate the fact that something's happening and that there's something is afoot. The spirit is moving, it feels like the winter is thawing on this kind of materialist, secular, post-Christian culture that we've all just kind of assumed is going to be the eternal state of the Western world, and it just feels like something's changing. Aslan is on the move and all of that. So I'm kind of cautiously hopeful. I think the big concern for me right now, and something that I've been talking about in the new season of the podcast series that I host on this subject, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, is the political dimension of it. And it's not that moves of this kind are always at some level attended by the political circumstances, so there's no surprise that there's an overlap between the vibe shift in politics and the fact that many young men are also turning towards more traditional forms of religion and so on. But I think that the danger is that you can easily swap the true spiritual awakening for a sort of political, project. And that's, I think, where there's an interesting dance happening at the moment between certain people who want to see a return to Christian values and are quite happy for a kind of cultural Christianity to come along and find its place. But I don't know whether that's the real thing, and that's my concern, is that you're in danger of swapping out the real thing for a kind of proxy, which won't in the end be helpful for anyone, I don't think.
You've anticipated exactly where I was thinking to go next. I mean, it's really fascinating what you say about your own church of origin, almost as if you can only get a revival if you're not looking for one, or it only comes when your sort of gaze is focused in the other direction. And there's a lot of wisdom to that, I think, and also the wariness of political power that has always served the church, I think, and much as the embrace of political power has at many points in history corrupted the church. This tale is old as time. And this is one area in which it seems as if the situation is rather different in the UK and in the US. In the US, it feels as if the religious shift is aligned or parallel with the very dramatic political shift we've just had. And it's not just that we elected a different president, as I'm sure you know, it's that the whole mood of the country changed overnight. And then it was followed up by a very kind of muscular and aggressive first 100 days of this second Trump presidency. And so it's all been kind of quite striking and stunning. And I think everybody's reeling, but also it feels of a piece. And that comes with its own advantages and challenges. Advantages like institutionally, politically, it's probably going to be easier in the next 4 years to really push some form of national Christianity ahead. But is that in fact what we're looking for? Are people picking up the faith kind of as a part of a goodie bag of identity markers for the in club? All of this is radically different as I observe from afar in the UK, in that you still have that spirit movement that you're describing, but it feels almost entirely at odds with some of the political developments. I mean, the story that's made a big splash over here is the fellow who was arrested for praying outside of an abortion clinic, and that's been emblematic for us of just a real antipathy between maybe a popular Christian movement and institutional power. But I'm always wary talking or thinking about UK politics from the US, because we don't know how to cover other countries at all. So please tell me what you think about this.
Yeah, and it's always interesting when I do talk to my American friends about what's being picked up at your end on the news cycle versus at our end. And to be honest, a lot of our news cycle is taken up with American politics anyway, so it's kind of one of those things. But I suppose, what I would say is there are definitely shared characteristics between both of us, because there are, the fact is, because we live in such a globalized culture, and the internet just sort of does mean we're having very similar experiences on both sides of the pond. There are certain things like, for instance, this, I think, male identity kind of meaning crisis that's been happening in the West has equally impacted both sides of the Atlantic. And to that extent, what we're seeing in the UK in terms of a lot of young men taking in renewed interest in faith and Christianity is, I think, to some extent mirrored in the USA, where there's a kind of a shift. And it is, as you say, aligned with this political vibe shift. And there's a sense in which a lot of young men feeling rootless, feeling like they're being sort of, to some extent, sidelined by the dominant culture, are now looking for an expression, something that will give them a sense of grounding, purpose, meaning, a rule for life. And they're looking, interestingly, at the quite sort of traditional forms of Christianity, be it Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, or just sort of, quite down the line conservative kind of evangelical kind of ways of looking at life. And I hear that all the time from church leaders on this side of the pond as well. They're talking about young men turning up in their churches. No one's invited them. They're just turning up. They've maybe bought a Bible. They've maybe been watching Jordan Peterson. They've maybe been influenced by Tom Holland, the historian, in his case for the Christian foundations of the West. And they're kind of saying, I'm looking for a better story. And it's fascinating to see that happening in real time. So there's kind of, and I think that's to some extent shared, on both sides of the pond, that dynamic is happening. There is a different political sort of backdrop to that, though. And I think it's almost, there's a sort of, arguably a kind of confidence to some extent that the vibe shift in the US has given to certain brands of Christianity to just go out and do its thing. I think in the UK we're still a little bit like, oh, what's going on? We've never had this before. And we're sort of just struggling to keep up. I think the difference is that there is obviously the UK also has had its kind of Donald Trump type moments. We had Brexit in 2016. Yes. We have had a real sense of, unease and disquiet from parts of the country who aren't happy with the current political order, as it were. And there are, and when I'm out in London, you talk to the average cabbie, they'll often say, well, I think we could do with a bit more of a like Trump kind of, move fast and break things kind of attitude. So it's not that that doesn't exist here. It's just that the current Labour government, as it were, is not the obvious example of that happening. The reality is the reason Labour got in the last election is a lot to do with the fact that reform, which is the kind of closest thing to a kind of Donald Trump style form of politics in the UK, it made such big gains that it basically split the vote for the Conservative Party. And so Labour were the ones who in the end benefited. But it's not because Labour had suddenly become very popular. It's because actually things had moved, on the Conservative side in a more rightward direction, arguably. So I think there are similar kind of things happening actually in the UK as have happened in the US. I think it's still not as pronounced, though, the political dimension of it in the UK. And what I tend to find more in the church circles, specifically, I move, because the churches, I think that's the big difference. We don't really have a very strong kind of Christian right in the way that you've had for quite a long time in the US. And that is a big difference. And so the way that it's coming through in the UK is more that as these meaning seekers and so on are coming through into the churches, I think the churches are then trying to serve them, but they're not necessarily looking to meet that arguably more kind of nationalistic or populist kind of form of politics that some of them may want to be bringing with them. It's tended, I think a lot of the churches are sort of just trying to do a good job of discipling them into, I guess, Christianity per se, that isn't particularly of a kind of particularly left or right wing variety. So there's it's just a difference in the way that kind of movement is kind of being met by the church. Whereas I think there's certainly a segment in the US church where they're kind of quite happy to kind of embrace that more kind of conservative nationalist kind of political vibe along with the meaning seekers who are coming with it, if you know what I mean.
It's fascinating. There's some parallels in what you've just said with what's going on in Germany at the moment as well, politically at least. Your explanation of why Labour has made gains is recognizable to me. And you reminding me of when I was in Oxford for my graduate degree. It was over the course of 2016 and subsequent years, and you're reminding me that it used to be when you talked to people who were panicked about the direction of politics and who deplored everything that was going on, it used to be Trump and Brexit. They would almost always mention those two things in the same breath. It was sort of this Anglo-American populist conflagration that people were worried about, and that's changed slightly, although it's not necessarily. The story remains, I think, kind of unwritten or unfinished in that domain. You've mentioned young men a couple times, and I think this is an important dimension of the whole thing. You say, and this strikes me as correct, that young men are acutely feeling the meaning crisis in ways that perhaps young women aren't, or young women are feeling it differently. And this revival or this awakening or whatever it is that we're looking at also has a male character. It has the character of men returning to the church, the proportion of young men relative to young women in churches rising. And we've seen a number of news stories about that. There is also, I think, there are a variety of other options on the cart available to young men who are suffering from the meaning crisis at the moment. And those too have risen to prominence with alarming speed. So I'm thinking about, of course, Andrew Tate. I'm thinking about some of this weird anti-Semitism that at least has grown up on the right. At least there's a real kind of swamp there as well. And at the same time, I'm thinking about the long-standing critique of the church that I've heard from people on the right, that it's quote unquote feminized, that it has become Christianity has become associated with softness and meekness and soft-spokenness and all these things. And looking at the churches around me, I can see why people say that, and I can see why that might, in fact, make it hard for young men to really get excited about going to church. And I can see how there would be a very welcome and needful kind of shift in that mentality. On the other hand, there's part of me that remains in reservation, because historically, some of the things that make Christianity distinctive, and that will, going forward, distinguish it from people like Andrew Tate, from other sort of like Mannerbund options that these guys might go for, is that it places a uniquely high premium on femininity, womanhood, and that it emphasizes these, values of mercy alongside values of strength. These are all things that made Christianity radical, unique, countercultural, that remain sort of important elements of it. So I guess my question to you is just what do you make of, how seriously do you take a figure like Tate as a competitor to Christianity, as an answer to the meaning crisis, and what do you think the church's right response to all of that is?
And I would add to Andrew Tate, in terms of the list of options for young men, I mean, another significant one that shouldn't be dismissed is fundamentalist Islam, and that is actually, you'd be surprised at how many young Western men that is actually attracting, because again, it's offering this kind of very muscular form of identity, a tribe to belong to. I was chatting with my Muslim barber the other day, and he's doing Ramadan and the fast, and there's something quite appealing about the kind of the routine of that, and and so on. And I just think that what the church is, if you like, competing with, if that's the right word, is ways in which those different people, whether it be Tate with his kind of, super macho, the guy with the biggest harem wins at life approach, or the kind of big kind of, the strictures of Islam, or whatever it might be, it's something about this identity that young men in particular are craving, and that they've kind of been starved of in a world which has basically completely dissolved the differences between men and women in lots of ways, or right, has even sort of arguably, whenever masculinity is talked about, we're told it's toxic and everything. And I think that goes very deep. And the church, I think, has to take seriously the fact that these other options are kind of where a certain number of young men are gravitating towards. And it can't simply try and do a Christian version of Andrew Tate or Islam, because in a sense it has the original model in the person of Jesus, but it is a very countercultural example, because Jesus was not married. He never had sex with anyone. He did, but at the same time he gathered around a group of young men, and he, through his example and his life, he taught them, and he took them on this adventure, this extraordinary adventure that led to most of them being persecuted, tortured or killed in the end. And yet they laid down their life because of the example he's shown them. So there's always going to be this tension, I think, in Christianity, because this is also the same person who, within his time and place, completely revolutionized the way that we think about women and their place in culture. He was someone who lifted up the estate of women and what they bring. And so all of that has to go into the way that the church presents following Christ to young men. And I think there has been arguably a kind of feminization, but it's kind of because men have retreated from the church, and so inevitably you tend to see an imbalance coming out at that point. I've been involved in apologetics really most of my life, and it's funny because it goes in the other direction. 90% of the people who listened to my show and turned up at the conferences I hosted were men. And I think you just have to recognize that there are just natural differences on average. Obviously, this is, not true of everyone, but on average between men and women in the way they experience faith and kind of the church has to be a place where you bring both of those together and the head and the heart meet, and you have that kind of polarity between men and women, bringing in this beautiful mixture and fusion, and not sort of blame it on one or the other, but simply to say, we know we need both of these at the table. And to the extent that we've excluded one or the other, we've done a huge disservice to the church. And my hope is that, perhaps what we need to do is to ask, well, where have we been letting men down in the church? Where have we been kind of not giving them the kind of challenge that actually they're looking for, especially young men, to do something different, adventurous, that kind of will, mean sort of surrendering their life to, and so on. And I think that's kind of what, especially right now, young men are looking for. It's not to say that isn't equally true of women, but I think it just often hits differently at different points, in the church when you've got a sort of, just a different dynamic going on that men respond to in a certain way. So I just think we need to be very careful of chasing after something that is kind of being embodied by the male influencers, the bros like Tate, but at the same time acknowledging that there are kind of very specific ways in which men are lit up by faith, and to lean into those because they're part of our tradition,
I love the idea of the apostles as a band of brothers. I don't think I've ever quite thought of it that way, but that's, of course, absolutely right. Justin Brierley, I could keep you here for hours and hours, but I know it's late in the UK. So please, just to close us out, tell listeners where they can find you, the title of the new book, and where they can follow you.
The new book is called Why I'm Still a Christian, and it's really my case for faith after 20 plus years now of hosting conversations between Christians and atheists. So you can find that wherever you get your books from. It's published by Tyndale. If you want more info, though, on the other book and podcast series that's mentioned, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, my website is a good place to go. That's justinbrierley.com.
Terrific. Thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
Thank you, Spencer.